Hey Village, welcome to our weekly recap episode. I know, a bit of a change of scenery. I'm outside today enjoying our wonderful Pacific Northwest sun that comes out, once every blood moon. No, just kidding. This past Sunday, Pastor Paul preached a message titled Searching for Meaning in our continuation of our sermon series on the book of Philippians, titled A Defiant Nevertheless. So when thinking about our search for meaning, there's a lot of ground we can cover. We can cover the philosophical pursuit, the scientific pursuit of meaning called epistemology, the way or the study of how you and I know things. But I think in a Christian value system or worldview, if you will, the way you and I search for meaning or create meaning is through Christ. The Apostle Paul says we are to take every thought captive. So our thoughts are the components by which we create meaning. Our thoughts are to be taken captive in service to Christ. That you and I are only, as followers of Jesus, to interpret the events of the world, the events of our lives through the framework and lens of who Jesus is and what he has done for us. So this past Sunday, when Pastor Paul was talking about the tragic burden that you and I might have to carry in regards to the tragedy and the difficulties and the suffering we experience in our lives, it may feel meaningless if we don't know to what end. It may feel meaningless if the suffering and the tragedy we experience is just another component of life, as if we're stuck in this cycle of tragedy and of pain. But what the Apostle Paul points out to us in the letter to the church in Philippi is that our joy is not dependent upon the absence of suffering. Our joy is not dependent upon getting what we want, but rather joy is found in the life that Christ gives us, in Christ's life. That's why our lives have meaning. That's why when we search for meaning, we can find it secure and stable in Christ. That's how you and I can make sense of the suffering we experience. Not that we have an answer for why we suffer or why bad things happen, but we have a precise and stable and sturdy answer in that there's one who suffers with us. The theologian Pastor Karl Barth, that we've mentioned numerous times now, talks about how you and I live in the shadow of the cross. That just as God created the world to have a day and a night, so too are our lives created with a day and a night. And because of sin, we live often in that night, the night of sin, of suffering, and of sorrow. But you and I also live in the shadow of the cross. And for Barth, he says, suffering comes from Jesus. Not that Jesus causes our suffering, or wills our suffering, or desires our suffering, but suffering comes from Jesus because precisely on the cross, God suffers. God's self suffers on the cross. And God takes our suffering and makes it his suffering, so that by transitive properties, his joy becomes our joy. Suffering comes from Christ because now his joy is our joy, and therefore our suffering is not meaningless or nihilistic. Our suffering is not whimsical or pointless, but rather our suffering has a profound linkage and tying in to Christ. That the life of Christ and his joy becomes our joy because our suffering is now God's suffering upon the cross. God's suffering on the cross is a product of sin. It's a product of our rebellion and rejection of God. It's a product of God's judgment. But then on the cross, God's joy is now our joy. Therefore, our suffering finds profound meaning. Our lives find profound meaning because it is Christocentric. It is secure in Christ. And so that's the thought I would love to leave you with today, is what does it look like for your joy to be, or God's joy to be your joy, because your suffering is God's suffering on the cross? What does it look like for you and I to live lives full of meaning, abundant, rich in meaning? So these are some of the other questions. If you're a follower of Jesus, how did you first encounter God? How did you first fall in love with him? And since then, how has the trajectory and the course of your life shaped you to be more like him, to be more like God? How do you keep the love that you first had for Jesus relevant in your life? What are the needs in your life right now? And what is your prayer to make that life story, the story of Jesus, a reality? So grateful to be joining you for this episode of The Recap. I hope that you found it stimulating, if not encouraging. And we are continually praying for you, Village, every Tuesday as a staff, that the Lord keeps you and blesses you and protects you through the shipwrecks and storms of our lives. Thank you so much for watching this episode of The Recap, and looking forward to joining you for our next episode next week. Thanks.